This is an exhibition at a very, I suppose, a very pivotal point in my career as an artist. It's about process, it's about time, it's about the landscape of Wales to a certain extent, and it's about my inner landscapes as well. I suppose the places that I go to, that I explore for whatever reason, that I keep returning to, and which are central to my work. My background is in printmaking. Around about 25 years ago, I came across a series of holograph prints by an artist called Peter Ray. I looked at these particular prints and thought, that's what I want to do. I think the richness of colour in the way that the images were inked up, the surface textures just completely seduced me in Ray's holographs, and I knew that's where I wanted to go. So probably for 10 years, maybe a bit less, I worked in fairly isolated fashion and developed a vocabulary, a way of working, which I think perhaps because of the isolation or the isolated circumstances was fairly unique. The images were populated largely by creatures that are archetypal, that were hugely significant to me for whatever reason. I didn't really quite know why then, I don't think, but which were also hugely significant within the culture of Wales itself. So this series of images is based on the hunt for the Twrch Troeth from Tyl Culhwch and Olwen, which is in the Mabinogion. But I think at the same time the wild boar carries all sorts of symbolism, well certainly did for the people of prehistoric Wales, as a sort of symbol of ferocity and strength. But perhaps also as a sort of a male archetype, which for whatever reason is very, very important to me. The surface textures of these are as important as their narrative content. It's a wild boar on a stone, and that can be read in almost a second by anyone looking at it. But I think what is of equal, if not greater importance, is the sort of the finer detail, the surfaces within them, the patterns of age which tell stories of their own. They're the reason that I was drawn to this particular medium. The boars themselves are part animal, but they're partly man-made as well. There are bits of bone, there are tusks which are organic, there are bits of wicker. If you look at the rib cage of the creatures themselves, it's almost like a sculptural basket. There are bits of old thread there, and I suppose I wanted them to look as though they had been assembled from a load of bits and pieces that might have been lying around in a museum store for the best part of a century and been forgotten, and either been assembled or perhaps reassembled themselves from these composite parts. I was very fortunate in being awarded a Creative Wales Award by the Arts Council, which bought me the best part of a year just to play, which is a fabulous opportunity, is what all artists need. And I suppose I had got to the point where I couldn't ignore any longer the sort of cacophony of people saying, you've got to make this artwork move. It's just made to come to life. And so that's what I did with my Creative Wales Award. I started to cut up my prints, and I learned how to take these already composite creatures into another place by dividing them up and making all the sections move. So the creature could come to life and take on expressions. And so this is the Twrch Troeth, who is the star of my very first experimental film. And this is the printing, rather a print I made, which I could very specifically cut up and animate for the story. When we cut one of these prints up and assemble all the bits, we end up with well, these guys here. They're all the same bit of artwork, but they can move, and you can kind of see a progression. It's almost like looking at frames in an animated piece. His head is actually sort of being tossed from one side to the other there, and you can get an idea of how the different parts move independently. I find when I was working on a printing plate, which is a very slow process, the ideas for the next image would come, and the next one after that, and narratives would always form themselves, and those narratives would be very often based in journeys. Helar Tuchtroith, my first experimental short film, was based on the hunt for the Tuchtroith from Keilach and Olwen, and I suppose I wanted to make a road movie there, from Pembrokeshire to the River Severn in the east, and maybe that's one of the reasons that I put him on wheels, perhaps to convey that sort of sense of road movie. And I think what's an important point about that particular film is that I wanted to reference the very great age of the story, which is probably prehistoric in origin, and the landscape from which that story sprang. So I filmed the landscape, and I put these characters in the landscape alongside prehistoric objects. And this introduced me, well, it gave me a wonderful entree to the fabulous collections of the National Museum of Wales, the National Museum of Ireland, the Museum of Scotland, and eventually the British Museum as well. So from that grew this process of combining landscape, stories, characters from that landscape, and objects from that landscape. And I think because I've always enjoyed working with people, I like teamwork, I think maybe I had enough of working in a studio by myself for a decade. You kind of want to get out and interact with people, otherwise you go mad. This way of working with large groups of people, with community groups in their place, in their landscape, with their stories, with their ancestral objects, that grew. And that took me on a long journey of its own, which probably lasted 6 or 7 years. This piece is called The Wild, and it represents, I suppose, maybe the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. Having worked with major institutions, various museums, making films with community groups, I suppose I started to crave my own space again, room for my own creativity, which I'd always been able to bring to the previous film projects, because someone ultimately in a big project has to kind of direct it, and that was my role. But I wanted to be able to explore certain ideas by myself. So I eventually found the space in 2012 to make this piece. I think having been making films for 6 or 7 years, I'd actually, as you'd hope, got better at it. I spent a lot of time in the landscape with a camera, and I think my ability to use that had improved, as had my ability to animate. And I really wanted to sort of see what I could achieve in terms of those processes by myself with my own ideas. And so this film really is about my love of printmaking, I suppose. Having really decided 7 or 8 years ago that I'd had enough of working by myself, I really started to crave materials. I think if you exist in the digital world as an artist all the time, or certainly for me, I really begun to miss making things, smelling things, and repetitive process, which is what my particular printmaking was all about. And I'd also become aware, having discussed the notion of creativity with all sorts of people, including scientists, we'd found this shared process whereby in resolving problems, whether they be creative or scientific, to use very broad labels, that it was when we turned our back on a particular problem and went out for a walk or went to cut the grass or listened to music or whatever, that was when the answers came. And so I suppose reflecting on that, it became apparent to me that the printmaking process, which for me is highly repetitive, was a kind of a meditation. And when engaged in it, it took me to a place, not a conscious place, wherever it is all artists go to, and all scientists as well, I think, where we go to sort things out. And so this is kind of an attempt to capture that journey. It begins in my studio, it goes to that other place, and it comes back, all framed within the printmaking process and the making of one image. And so the central character of this piece, which is made in 2012, is actually my friend, the Tuchtroith, who was the star of my very first animated film in 2005. So it represented, again, the turning of a full circle. I've always been interested in, I love making things, and I suppose there's a little bit of a sculptor in me. They say that all printmakers are frustrated sculptors. And I became interested in the idea of somehow creating moving images that escaped from the rectangle, from the flat frame. And this piece, I suppose, represents it's a magic lantern. It's a three-dimensional image, which is different from wherever you view it. And I hope that people looking at it will, they will dictate the point at which they look at it from. It's entirely up to them. I hope people will explore it. I love just exploring it, finding new little reflections, new textures, new little sparkles. And it, again, comes back to cyclical time. In working with the various museums that I have, I've been incredibly fortunate in having up-close encounters with some extraordinary objects. And without consciously doing it, I've moved back in time. When I made Hela Tuchtroith, most of the objects there were from the Celtic Iron Age. And I suppose working with archaeologists who specialised in different periods pulled me into a fascination with archaeology and the nuances and the minutiae of it. Yeah, as I said, without being or wishing to do this at all consciously, I seem to have slipped further back in time and arrived back here. This piece is actually focused on a piece called The Swimming Reindeer, which is in the British Museum's collection. It's the oldest sculpture, that's how they term it, in their collection, and around about 13,000 years old, made from the tusk of a mammoth, and depicting a point in the migration cycle of the reindeer towards the end of the last ice age. The piece was found in a rock shelter overlooking a river, And it's tempting to think that 13,000 years ago, an artist, perhaps like me, was sitting up there and felt the creative urge to actually capture that particular moment in time. But of course it was a moment that repeated itself every year ad infinitum, because that's what reindeer do. They migrate. Migratory cycles just go round and round and round and round and round. So as an artist, as an individual, as I've got older, I kind of realised that things do repeat themselves. The saying is, history repeats itself. I've come back to parts of my process again, having thought that I would abandon them forever at certain points. You come back to it. I look at my children, I look at my daughter, and I see my grandmother in my daughter's face when she's sleeping. And so all this reinforces some sort of sense of things just going round and round and round. And this piece is inspired by a structure called an orrery, which was very fashionable in the 18th century, a rich man's toy, I suppose, which demonstrated the workings of the solar system. So this is my 21st century orrery. It obviously refers back to the 18th century version, which is featured in Joseph Wright of Derby's painting, A Philosopher Lecturing at the Orrery. I've ditched all the clockwork workings, beautiful though they were, and much as I love clockwork, with a 21st century digital cycle based on flickering light sitting within there. The piece actually goes round and round and round. The swimming reindeer come to life with a bang, and that bang perhaps represents the synapse in the mind of that Paleolithic maker or artist 13,000 years ago. The reindeer run, perhaps on their migratory journey, and at the end of it there's another synapse, a blinding flash of light perhaps, and they're frozen again within the piece, captured as it was 13,000 years ago. So perhaps this is me sharing a creative moment with that artist 13,000 years ago.